Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is one of those tennis court rooms where you have to look from side to side, so apologies to the people at the outside ends. And of course, this is a topic that's, if not as old as the hills, it's at least 150 years old in this country. Because in England, a system of state elementary schools was created in 1870 through the Elementary Education Act, while Gladstone was Prime Minister. And we were a few years behind much of Europe, but that mid-19th century was the great era of formation of state education. But it is a myth to think that most children got no education before that. Government funding was in fact channeled into voluntary school societies from the 1830s. And the patchwork of voluntary and proprietary schools was in fact already giving most children at least a few years of schooling. But it is genuinely interesting to read that the most contentious issue back then was religious education in the new board schools. Though not so much about whether it happened at all, but rather about whether it was specifically aligned with the Church of England. And the nonconformists of the day were making arguments that are actually not that dissimilar to those made by secular movements today. There was enormous discomfort about denominational religious instruction funded by rates, and there were several radically different proposals about how to handle the issue that were bitterly fought over. Gladstone himself would have preferred not to have the state take any responsibility for teaching religion, nor to have the state try and make an undenominational model of religious instruction. He and others thought that that was likely to fail. An Anglican himself, he probably would have preferred to have state-funded schools provide secular instruction only and merely give access to schools to clergymen and others to teach denominational beliefs. But to get his bill through, Gladstone had to compromise, and he accepted the Cooper Temple Amendment that specified that no religious catechism or formulary that was distinctive of a particular denomination should be taught in one of the new board schools. But there was no prescription or other constraint on what should be taught. He kept and strengthened the conscience clause that allowed parents to withdraw their children from religious instruction, and he specified that rates should only be used for secular instruction. He trod a narrow path between many factions to get his Education Act through. And by contrast, most other countries forming their education systems around that time concluded that state schools must be secular and that religious instruction must sit elsewhere. And generally, faith schools were left outside state funding arrangements. Gladstone's Act was in fact a classic example of the Great British Compromise. And we're living with that compromise to this day, though it has continued to be contentious throughout the intervening 150 years. And of course, some things have changed profoundly in that time. One of these is the increasing proportion of the population that describes itself as having no religion, now over a third. A second is the increasing religious diversity among those who do claim a religious identity. Less than half the population now describes itself as Christian, and a tenth describes itself as belonging to a non-Christian religion. And of course, for all religions, the level of adherence varies greatly. I think we do sometimes forget this. It isn't only Christians who sometimes wear their religion lightly. And a third change is the emergence of secular movements that show some of the characteristics of religions. The language of, for example, some of the more extreme environmental campaigners can sound a lot like that of Old Testament prophets. And there are parallels in other areas. And fourthly, I think there's been a progressive expansion in the role of the state. Those Victorian politicians debating that education bill would probably be astonished by the trend today. Increasingly, legislation goes far beyond sort of outlawing what's universally considered unacceptable. We now legislate to push people into behaving only in ways that align with current morality. The space between bad behavior and rudeness on the one hand and civil liability or criminality on the other is getting smaller. And when legislators move ahead of public opinion, even with the worthiest of intentions, they can alienate some sectors of the population. For more than a decade, the Equality Act has required all public bodies, including state-funded schools, to promote respect for all the protected characteristics, which include religion, and including gender reassignment status. It must have been obvious at the time that this wouldn't sit well with the most conservative believers, Christian and non-Christian, and with an increasing proportion of faith groups believing that faith prescriptions must come ahead of secular law, the discomfort is not reducing. And finally, and depressingly, there's perhaps a greater willingness to bully and intimidate in person and in the public realm, and to weaponize the statutory protections that are accorded to the various rights. And this is making it difficult to acknowledge the tensions between rights that will always and unavoidably conflict with each other, at least to some extent. And on top of what I think are the understandable sensitivities on the part of those with strong religious beliefs, it's certainly making it impossible to discuss the problems openly and honestly. And all of this is playing out in the school system today. In my 7 years as Chief Inspector at Ofsted, I drew on the evidence from our work in state and independent schools and looking at suspected illegal schools to talk about some of the problems that we saw. I'll talk about state schools first and come on to some of the problems in independent schools. And some of the difficulties are arising in areas where a high level of community segregation means that schools that are nominally community schools become de facto faith schools, sometimes run on quite narrow religious lines. Before I took over at Ofsted in 2014, the case of the so-called Trojan horse schools in Birmingham was widely covered. There have been many efforts to discredit Ofsted's work and its findings, but I've spoken myself to many of the people involved, including some of the senior inspectors who visited the schools, and have found no reason to doubt what they told me and what Ofsted reported. But the local authority was reluctant to acknowledge and act on the problems identified. Following that case, in 2016, Ofsted found significant sex discrimination at another community school in Birmingham, which was, rather surprisingly, being run on strict Islamic lines. And rather shockingly, the local authority contested the judgments and took the hate case to the High Court, where it succeeded. But Ofsted won the case in the Court of Appeal in 2017. Oddly, the Wikipedia page for the school, which has now closed, though it was updated as recently this year, mentions the High Court case, but omits the final outcome. I remember doing media interviews when that judgment was published. And what struck me was that while there were a number of news stories on the day, the issues the case raised sank like a stone in a pond. You might think that serious broadcasters and print media commentators would have wanted to discuss the implications of allowing a community school to be run as a faith school and to allow the application of religious principles to override, for example, protections against sex discrimination. But no one wanted to do so, perhaps because the Trojan horse case had attracted such hostility. Similarly, when Yesterday Hatorah School was judged inadequate in 2018, in the light of a heavily redacted curriculum and other failings, after a few headlines, there was extraordinarily little discussion of the acceptability of a state school teaching a curriculum that fell so far short of national curriculum expectations to accommodate Haredi Jewish sensitivities. At the time, I remember there were accusations by the school of Ofsted having a secularist agenda. But we have a legislative architecture that requires religious rights to be balanced with others. There is no priority in law, and Ofsted must, of course, act in line with that architecture. But this is too easily characterized as Ofsted having an explicitly anti-faith agenda. In 2018, again, a community primary school in East London came under really intense pressure from faith groups following a decision by the head not to allow hijabs for girls aged 7 and under. And ironically, that decision was actually made to reduce the extent to which different preferences among Muslim parents could intrude on school harmony. And my stating publicly that this was a legitimate decision by the head drew public claims of Islamophobia, more than 1,000 letters of complaint, I think, and some deeply unpleasant threats. And then few of you can have missed the case of the Batley Grammar School teacher forced into hiding. DfE, the Department for Education, sent its own Regions Group staff to look into that case, not Ofsted inspectors, and the school wasn't due for inspection at the time, so I never had the full picture. And there's no more recent published inspection report for that school on the Ofsted website. But from all these, I think there's an important point to draw out here. These cases, I think, show that a school having secular status of itself doesn't offer much protection if most parents want their children's education constrained by their religious preferences, or if influential faith groups or individual actors in local communities are able to exert substantial pressure on schools. And looking across to France, where laïcité is embedded in the school system, it doesn't seem to be preventing such cases. The shocking case of the murder of Samuel Paty, 2 years after the Batley Grammar School case, and for a similar reason, sadly shows this. Turning to independent schools. Now, I should say, I do think it's important that independent schools can exist. States do not own children's lives, and it is right for parents to have some choice about how their children are educated, including the possibility of home education, though that shouldn't be an unconditional right. And states should take note when parents turn away from state schools and pay for independent schools. It may be telling them something about the quality and adequacy of state provision. But it is also important that there's clarity and a sufficient degree of consensus about what independent schools can and cannot be reflected in the regulatory regime. And I don't think that that's really there at the moment. The independent schools that Ofsted inspects are typically small and not well known. Many are privately owned special schools. This isn't where the difficulties arise. Many of the others are small faith schools, or schools that are not registered as faith schools, but do in practice draw their pupils entirely from a particular faith group. And whether they're Christian, Islamic, or Jewish, they tend to serve parents who want their child's life to be enclosed as far as possible within their faith group, so as to minimize their exposure to the rest of the world. Some of these schools are profoundly resistant to the expectations imposed on them by secular law, which they sometimes simply do not accept as having validity where it conflicts with religious tenets. But as the inspectorate, Ofsted must inspect independent schools for compliance with the independent school regulations, which incorporate those secular laws, including equality law. Clearly, Ofsted cannot create opt-outs, no matter how passionately individual beliefs are expressed. And where schools are not, for example, teaching the minimum expectations for relationships and sex education, it must report this. And this creates a lot of tensions. Faith group lobbyists have a lot of access and influence. In my time, ministers were mostly reluctant to acknowledge or address the underlying problems. They generally seemed to prefer to believe that problems were down to Ofsted inspectors not being nice enough. It's always easier to let the inspectorate take the heat than to acknowledge deep-rooted and highly contentious problems for which ministers have no magic wand. And there was often a mischaracterization of the problems. An unusually high proportion of these small faith schools offer a poor education in the foundations of English, maths, and the other national curriculum subjects, and do not manage the basics of safeguarding well. Relatively few do poorly on inspection only because they don't comply with equality-related expectations. And the picture's worse for illegal schools, which nearly always operate within a particular faith community. Our dated legal framework doesn't even contemplate the possibility of an operator not wanting to make a school that operates within the law. But the conditions in some of these establishments are dreadful, yet parents are choosing them for religious reasons. And then there are the opt-outs. I'm very proud, by the way, that Ofsted secured a number of convictions for running illegal schools. In my time was the first time that the CPS had ever taken those cases, and there were convictions and reconvictions for some of those schools. And there are the opt-outs. It's ludicrous that a school that has children full-time and offers only religious teaching can argue that it doesn't need to register as a school because it teaches no secular subjects. There was one attempt to legislate in my time, but it fell for other reasons. And a lot of this inertia does come down to political will. I did find that in my time, politicians were generally reluctant to talk about these really difficult and emotional issues. When I talked publicly about these cases and the issues they raised, I was on my own. In fact, the last Education Secretary who was willing to be robust was Michael Gove, and he left that job a decade ago. He made worthwhile efforts to establish the core of a set of common values for all pupils and for all schools to help build genuine community cohesion. But perhaps for administrative reasons, they were set out in the context of Prevent, a counter-terrorism strategy, and that created a taint that lingers to this day, although in fact, that set of British values has real merit and parallels those that are being made explicit and reinforced in other countries for similar reasons. Which brings me on to what I really want to say today. As I noted earlier, the difficulties relating to religion are arising in non-faith schools as well as in faith schools. And of course, there is no such thing as values-free education, at least in an education that goes beyond mathematics and hard sciences, perhaps. Simply taking religion out of the picture won't solve the tensions of the kind that I've discussed. Remember the religious group protests against relationships and sex education in Birmingham primary schools, for example. The truth is that we do need a better developed set of British values, built for maximum consensus so that as many parents as possible will be happy to choose state schools by default. In a country with rising levels of self-segregation, schools are one of the few places that people from all backgrounds generally interact, other than sitting side by side in hospital clinics or on buses. So I do think values of these kinds need to be explicit and incorporated as a foundation of our education system. And they also need to be durable. If they build in every fashionable issue of the day, they won't command sufficient consensus, and they won't stand the test of time. This wouldn't be easy, and it would require the strength to stand up to some vigorous and hugely emotional campaigning. But it is in the interests of all our young citizens to do this and to do it well. And we also need acceptance from the education sector that state schools shouldn't go beyond that agreed set of values. One thing I've noticed is that people often don't recognise overreach where it aligns with their own political preferences. It's difficult for Ofsted to inspect against the requirement for schools to be politically impartial for precisely that reason. Generally, it comes about because teachers are pursuing their passions and what feels morally right to them, and they don't recognise that they're going into politically contested spaces. So, to give an example, there's a very strong consensus about taking responsibility for the environment and climate for the benefit of future generations as well as the current generation. But that doesn't mean that everyone agrees on how best to translate this into action. There needs to be a greater willingness to acknowledge that state schools and their teachers shouldn't push children in their own preferred directions. So I'm not offering any easy solutions, but as I hope what's come through from what I've said, I think it's desperately important that there is much more national conversation and action on these really important issues. Thank you.